Hello and welcome to CrimeDivers. I'm Jill, and for the first time on a regular episode, I'm here by myself. So unfortunately, this week we had a technical problem. Laura came to my house a few days ago and we recorded 3 episodes. And then later, when I went to schedule them for the days that they're meant to be published, I realised that none of the recordings had any sound. So I contacted our podcast host and they tried to sort it, and me being me, somehow managed to lose all 3 of the recordings. So Laura hasn't got time to come and record them again, and we want to stick to our schedule. You know, we didn't want to miss any weeks. So we decided that I would just record myself for this episode, next week's episode, and I already recorded a Patreon one. So we will be back to normal with Laura here in a couple of weeks. So I apologise in advance if you prefer it when Laura's here, or if I just don't do a very good job, but what can you do? So today my episode is called A Deadly Attack, and we are in the UK, so let's just dive in. On the 25th of September 2015 in Bristol, England, in the early hours of the morning, Dr. Nicola White was woken up by someone shouting, "Help me, please, somebody help me." She got up and she looked out of her window and she saw a man standing outside in just his boxer shorts, and from his head down to his shoulders, it looked like he was covered in mud. Nicola was like, what the hell is going on? Like, is this guy for real? Is he playing a prank? Like, what's going on? She thought the guy was on drugs, and she just thought, she just went back to bed. But then she soon got up again, because he was still making noise. So she looked out the window and she saw another man walking towards him, armed with a golf club for protection, because he had no idea as well what was going on with this guy, you know, whether he was dangerous or not. So Nicola, she saw that other people were, starting to gather. So she went outside to see what was going on. And when she got closer, she realised that this guy didn't have mud on his face at all. His skin was melting. Other neighbours also came out. One of them was Thomas Sweet, and he said that he thought the noise was foxes fighting. But when he saw the man, he thought he had paint all over his face. He, along with other neighbours, took him into one of the flats and put the man in the shower while another one called emergency services. So this man was 28-year-old Mark van Dongen. He was originally from the Netherlands. 5 years early, he had been recently diagnosed with HIV, and he was on a dating site which was specifically for people living with HIV. And that's where he started chatting to a woman called Berlinah Wallace, who was originally from South Africa, but she was now living in the UK. She told him how she had been in a relationship with a man when she was just 14, and she had quickly got pregnant and gave birth to a son. Unfortunately, her boyfriend died unexpectedly, and a few years later, so did her son. Later, she contracted HIV from being gang raped when she was 20, and she was now 41 and she was looking for her soulmate. Mark was 23, but the age gap didn't bother him. He really liked chatting to her, and he visited her a few times in England that first year. After about a year, they decided to move in together because Berlinah told Mark that she was pregnant. So Mark moved from the Netherlands to Bristol in England, and soon after, Berlinah told him that she had miscarried the baby. I don't think she was ever pregnant. I think she was just saying that to get him to come and move in with her. He worked as a site engineer and quickly got a job. He earned good money, and he would financially support Berlinah as she was doing a fashion course at university. At first, as with any relationship, all was well. They travelled together, they socialised together. Mark's family would come over to England to stay with them, and they would go to Berlin to visit his dad, Keys. But things started to go downhill when Berlinah started to become abusive. One day, Mark was sitting in their flat watching TV, and Berlinah came up behind him and just threw boiling hot water over his right arm. He had to go to hospital to be treated for the burns, but he made the excuse that he had spilt a cup of tea over himself. When he later told the police about that incident, after what happens at the time of this crime, he couldn't even remember why she did it. He just said that she was upset about something and that she would often get upset about the smallest of things. She once accused him of cheating, and that argument lasted for 2 weeks. And after that, she hid his passport so that he wouldn't be able to go to a hotel or go to an airport. He wouldn't be able to go back to the Netherlands. He wouldn't be able to go back home. She would often hit herself in the face and tell Mark that if he phoned the police on her, then she would just tell them that he had hit her. So he tried to leave her several times, but he would go back as he felt sorry for her and also out of fear as well. Berlinah would use his money to send back to her family in South Africa, and Mark didn't try and stop her as he was scared of her. This went on for a few years. I think they were together, all in all, I think they were together for 5 years. And eventually Mark decided he'd had enough and he was leaving her. He then met a woman called Violet, and although he was still living with Berlinah, he started seeing Violet. He told Violet that he was still living with Berlinah, but was making plans to leave. And Violet said that they should stop seeing each other until he sorted himself out. So a few days later, Mark told Violet that he had moved out of the flat and he was now staying in a hotel, and they started seeing each other again. A wee while later, Mark checked out of the hotel and he moved in with Violet. But Violet was shocked when she saw the state of Mark. On his neck, he had a gouge which had clearly been made by a fingernail, and he also had gouges on his back and chest from where Berlinah had attacked him, so she obviously hadn't taken the breakup very well. Violet soon began receiving silent phone calls, which were obviously from Berlinah, and Berlinah kept phoning Mark, and she was threatening to kill herself. She once told him that she had taken an overdose, so he called an ambulance to go to her, but he didn't go back, so her blackmail wasn't working. And I'm not sure if she actually did take an overdose, but she told him that she had. So when that didn't work, she used various tactics to try and make Mark come back to her. She said that she would tell everybody that he was a paedophile, or that he had committed fraud, or that he had previously been a sex worker. He hadn't done any of these things, and still he wasn't giving in. He wasn't going back to her. She told him that she was worried about how she was going to cope financially without him. And he told her, something along the lines of that they'd been together for 5 years, he had loved her. If she'd just stop being a twat, then he would help her. He didn't want things to end on bad terms, and, obviously he just didn't want any drama. So it just goes to show what a nice guy that he was, that after all she had done, he was still willing to help her out. But she was angry. She wanted to hurt him. And at the start of September 2015, Mark called the police and reported her for stalking and blackmailing him. And he also told them about her making silent phone calls to Violet. So the police visited her and gave her a warning for harassment. The day after that, Berlinah phoned a mental health crisis line and she spoke to someone for about half an hour. But later that day, she took an overdose and she was admitted to hospital. She was kept in overnight and discharged the following day. Not long after that, Berlinah emailed Mark and told him that a close friend of hers had had a heart attack, and she accused Mark of abandoning her in her time of need and told him that he had to phone her. So Mark did phone her because I'm assuming that he would have known this person as well that had the heart attack. So he did phone her and she was crying her eyes out, and she told Mark that she wasn't going to stop crying until he went to see her. But Mark said he didn't want to go and see her, and he asked her to leave him and Violet alone, and then he hung up the phone. But Berlinah just kept calling him and eventually Mark gave in and he picked up the phone. And she shouted down the phone that if he didn't go over to see her, then she was going to phone the police and tell them that he had been downloading images of child abuse. So Mark, not Mike. Mark was like, for fuck's sake, just piss off. And he phoned the police himself and told them what Berlinah was threatening and, asked them to do something about it. He went to the police station the next day and he showed them dozens upon dozens upon dozens of texts and emails that Berlinah had been sending him. But the officers decided that this wasn't harassment. They decided that this was just a woman pleading with her ex, wanting him back, which I found really astonishing, to be honest. That's not just a woman pleading with her ex. That to me, that's harassment. And would they look at it the same way if it was a man that was harassing the woman? Would they just see that as a man wanting his girlfriend back? I just don't think it would be the same. So an officer did talk to Berlinah, though, and told her that if she was struggling with the breakup, then she should make an appointment with her doctor. Mark had told the officer that he was still paying Berlinah's bills and her tuition fees for university, so the officer advised Berlinah to call the Citizens Advice Bureau and sort out her finances so that she didn't have to rely on Mark and they could have a clean break. So the officer told her to leave Mark and his new girlfriend alone and to cease all contact. So she did, for about 3 weeks. Then one day, Mark got a call from Berlinah. She told him that she was still struggling with her breakup, so she was going to quit uni and go back to South Africa. So, I'm sure Mark was well happy about that. The only thing was, she expected him to pay for her plane ticket. But Mark said, no, sorry, I'm not paying for it. Why should I? Which is fair enough. The following day, she called him again and asked him to go over. And I don't know why, but for some reason this time he agreed to go over that evening after work. So first he went home to Violet and told her that he was going to Berlinah's flat. Violet obviously wasn't too happy about it, but he told Violet that he was committed to their relationship, but he just had to go to Berlinah's to make sure she was okay and wasn't about to do anything to harm herself. So he arrived at Berlinah's at about 6 p.m. and they actually had dinner together and they talked about their relationship, but Mark was insistent that it was over. He had moved on, he was with Violet now, and he wasn't getting back together with Berlinah. So of course what had started as an amicable chat turned into a full-blown argument. And about 10 p.m, Berlinah packed a few things and told Mark that she was going to stay at a hotel, which I found very strange because it was her flat. But he was like, fine, see ya, I'll just stay the night here then. So, I did see that in a few different sources, so assuming that's right, I have no idea why that would be the case. I don't understand why Mark wouldn't just leave and go home to Violet's, and Berlinah, why wouldn't she just stay at her own flat? I don't know, but this is what I've read. So Berlinah left and Mark undressed and got into bed with just his boxer shorts on. So he soon fell asleep, but he was woken up at about 2:45 in the morning by Berlinah shaking him. He woke up and she was just laughing hysterically, and she told him, if I can't have you, then no one can, and she threw acid right in his face. So Mark jumped out of bed and ran out the house into the street screaming, help me, please somebody help me. As I said earlier, the neighbours got him into a shower while they waited for an ambulance. He was screaming in absolute agony. Mark's face had melted away. His eyes had turned grey and the irises had essentially dissolved. One of his ears had gone and so had his nose. When the paramedics arrived, they saw that he also had chemical burns to his abdomen, chest and thighs. The paramedic who travelled in the back of the ambulance with Mark said that Mark kept saying that he couldn't see properly and he kept asking if he still had eyelids. He was frothing at the mouth with what looked like grey coloured paint. He was given gas and air and it just wasn't helping. Mark was screaming in agony, and at one point he pointed to a tattoo on his stomach that said Berlinah, and he said, "Berlinah Wallace, she needs to go to prison for this." So he was determined, no matter what happened to him, he was telling them who had done it to him. So good on him. He then asked if officers could go and check on his girlfriend, Violet, because he was worried that Berlinah might have done something to her. You know, and I just thought to myself, what a guy. He's in agonising pain, and you would think that he wouldn't be able to think of anything else, but, you know, he's asking about his girlfriend. So, I mean, that's what I got from this case, is just what a nice guy he was. When they got to the hospital, Mark actually caught a glimpse of his face in a mirror, and he must have got the shock of his life because he screamed, "Kill me now." When his burns were assessed, it was found that the burns had affected 25% of his body. While Mark slipped into a coma, the police went to Berlinah's flat. As soon as they walked in, they could smell chemicals. Berlinah was calmly sitting on her sofa with a pair of jeans on top of a towel in front of her. So the police were like, you know, what are you doing? And she said that she was just using some acid to distress some fabric. There was a glass with some clear liquid in it next to a paintbrush. So they were like, well, was this what was used in the attack on Mark? And she said, yeah, it's sulfuric acid. So, of course, she was arrested and taken into custody. So when questioned, she told police that at about 3 a.m, her and Mark had an argument, and he became so violent. So to defend herself, she picked up what she thought was a glass of water from the bedside table and threw it at him. So she had told them that they had went to bed together, and when they lived together, he had always poured her a glass of water before bed. And he had earlier told her to use that water to take her medication with. So she was saying it was actually Mark who had put acid in that glass, and he'd wanted to burn Berlinah's insides when she took her medication. But the police were like, right, well, if that was an accident, you thought that was water, you had no idea that it was acid, why didn't you call an ambulance when Mark ran out of the flat screaming in agony? And she said it didn't even cross her mind. Like, what? How does it not cross your mind to call an ambulance when someone is running about screaming in pain? You know, you'd think that would be anybody's first instinct, but she just said she was too busy being confused. When she was asked why she had bought acid in the first place, she told them that she got it to clean the drains. But, of course, when the drains were checked, they knew it was bullshit because it was clear that the drains hadn't been cleaned in a long time. Berlinah told the police that Mark was abusive to her, like, all the way through their relationship, and that he had tried to kill her by putting the acid at the side of the bed. Detectives didn't believe her, and she was charged with throwing a corrosive substance with intent. Berlinah had deleted her internet browsing history, but the police were able to recover it, and they saw that she had visited 82 websites detailing what would happen to a human if they came into contact with sulfuric acid. She looked at articles about people who had acid thrown in their face. She googled what happens if you swallow sulfuric acid and can I die from drinking sulfuric acid? She had also researched a case from years before where a man had allegedly got his ex-girlfriend to drink acid by saying it was a last toast to the end of their relationship. The victim cried and screamed in agony for 23 minutes before the man called an ambulance. And by the time the paramedics got there, her mouth, throat and internal organs were all destroyed and she died in hospital. When in court charged with murder, the man said that she had drank it herself, mistaking it for water, and he walked free. So that must have been where Berlinah got the idea from to say that she thought it was water and that Mark was trying to kill her. On the same day that Mark had reported Berlinah to the police, she went on to Amazon and she bought the acid for £17 something. So it just goes to show how easy it was for her to get her hands on it, and how cheap as well. I mean, £17, that's nothing for what she was planning on using it for. So when it arrived, she removed the label, which of course had warnings about the acid being so dangerous. So that makes me think that she was going to act dumb when questioned by the police, like maybe tell them that she didn't realise how dangerous it was or something, because there wasn't a label on it. So Mark spent 11 months in intensive care, and he had several procedures to get all the dead tissue cut away from his body, and he got skin grafts. He had lost his left eye, and he could only just barely see out of the other, so he was nearly blinded. His face was disfigured, and unfortunately his left leg had to be amputated. He had to have an operation on his mouth just to be able to open it. His throat was so badly damaged that he had to have a tube inserted to keep his airways open. His heart, liver and kidneys had been damaged, and he was bleeding from his bowel. He had fluid on his lungs, so he had to get a tracheostomy tube to stop him from choking to death. He went into septic shock several times, and that caused his blood pressure to drop to potentially fatal levels, and he was paralysed from the neck down. He also couldn't talk as his vocal cords had been so badly damaged, and he was in so much pain that when his pain levels were assessed, professionals said that his pain was so high that basically if he had any more pain, the slightest bit more pain, his body would have shut down. And that was with him being on the strongest pain medication that there is. His dad, Keys, and his stepmom, Rita, had driven from Belgium to England as soon as they were contacted. And then after that, Keys would work in Belgium during the week, and he would visit Mark every single weekend. Once Mark was awake, which was about 4 months after the attack, Keys spent all his time by Mark's bedside. He would scratch Mark's itchy skin, and he would move his arms and legs regularly, as Mark couldn't do it himself. At first, Keys figured out a way for Mark to be able to communicate with him. He would go through the alphabet, and Mark would stick out his tongue when they got to the letter that he wanted, and he would be able to spell things out that way. But eventually the doctors were able to fit a speaking valve to the end of the tube in Mark's throat. He had months of speech therapy, and he did regain some of his voice. But Mark would never get his old life back. He would need constant round-the-clock care for the rest of his life, and he would always be in pain. Not surprisingly, he was diagnosed with depression and PTSD and was put on antidepressants. His dad, Keys, wanted Mark to move back to Belgium with him so he could look after him, but Mark wanted to stay in England to be close to Violet and asked if he could be moved to a care home. Violet was still very much committed to Mark, and she had visited him in hospital every day. So in November 2016, Mark was transferred to a care home. He told his dad to go back home to Belgium and get back to normal. He had a wife there, he had a job there, and Mark was okay. He was in the care home. He would be looked after. Violet would visit him every day. Things had to get back to some kind of normality. So Keys went back to Belgium. But the same day, I think he must have just not long got back, Keys got a phone call from Mark, and Mark was so distressed that Keys jumped in his car and drove all the way back to England from Belgium. When he got to the care home, it was the early hours of the morning, so he thought he'd better wait until a bit later to try and get in, so he decided to take a wee nap in his car. But soon after, he heard screaming, and he knew that it was Mark who was screaming, so he ran to the door and started banging on it to be let in. Eventually, somebody came and opened the doors for him, and Keys rushed to Mark's room. When he got there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mark was lying on his bed, covered in his own faeces. None of the staff would go anywhere near him because they were scared of his appearance, so they had just left him like that. Keys knew that he couldn't leave Mark there. So he got a private ambulance to take him to a hospital in Belgium, and he stayed with Mark the whole time when he got to the hospital in Belgium. He stayed with him the whole time until the staff got used to Mark's appearance, just to make sure that he was being looked after properly. Mark was assessed by 8 specialists, and by the end of the month he was told that unfortunately he would never regain movement in his body, so the paralysis was permanent. Mark had been holding on to the hope that one day he may be able to at least regain some movement. So to him, this was it. He had nothing left and nothing to live for. He wouldn't ever be able to move, and he would be in agonising pain for the rest of his life. So he made the decision to end his life. Euthanasia is legal in Belgium, so with his dad's full support, he submitted an application on the 1st of December 2016. And on the 2nd of January 2017 at 7:15pm, Mark and Keys had one final drink together and said their goodbyes before doctors administered the lethal injection in Mark's heart. Now that Mark had died, Berlinah was now charged with murder, and her trial started in November 2017. But her defence team argued that she hadn't murdered Mark because he had chosen to take his own life. So she was only found guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent, and she was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 12 years. The judge said, quote, "Your intention was to burn, disfigure and disable The judge said, quote, "Your intention was to burn, disfigure and disable Mark van Dongen so that he would not be attractive to any other woman," end quote. But personally, I think she should have been charged with murder, or maybe not murder, but she should have charged with something more than just throwing a corrosive substance, because yes, Mark did make the decision to to die, but if she hadn't attacked him, then he wouldn't have had to make that decision. So I do think, personally, that's just my opinion only, of course, but personally I do think that she should have got something more, something more than 12 years. But yeah, that was the case of Mark van Dongen. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.